Hello, I'm Bobby Duffy, and I'm Professor of Public Policy at King's College London and Director of the Policy Institute. I'm also author of the book, The Generation Myth, which I'm really delighted to be able to talk you through some of the key themes of today. And I guess if there was one underlying theme of the whole book, it's that, as we see on slide 2, it's that generational thinking is a really powerful idea, but that has been horribly corrupted by terrible stereotypes, myths, and cliches about generational differences. And when you look back at the history of generational thinking in sociology and philosophy, you'll see some of the biggest thinkers really put generational change at the center of how societies change. So perhaps most famously, Karl Mannheim, the Hungarian sociologist, gave us a lot of our thinking today about generations, how generation identities are formed over time, particularly when cohorts of young people go through particularly traumatic experiences, and how that's important for the development of societies. And that builds on thinking by others like philosopher Auguste Comte, who put generations really at the center of the speed of human development. And he said things like, we should not hide the fact that our social progress rests essentially upon death, because we get quite stuck in our ways once we get past a certain age. So the successive steps of humanity necessarily require continuous renovation from one generation to the next. So it is really sad then that if we look at slide 3, that today the type of depth of generational analysis is much more like these headlines around millennials are killing the napkin industry. And I could fill a whole presentation with things that millennials are supposed to have killed. This very superficial analysis. And it's not just millennials and young people that get picked on, it's also baby boomers. And they're more often accused of ruining things. In the case of this headline, parenting, but not just now, but forever. So it is a shame. And the reason it's a shame is because of what we see in slide 4. And my view is that you can only understand the future for societies if you understand generations based on just this simple fact. This shows the percentage of the UK adult population that come from each generation. And down the side, we've got the 5 generations that I look at in the book, which are the commonly discussed generations. And you can see over time, the balance of society is automatically shifting as older generations die out and are replaced by younger generations. So if there was something truly different between generations, that's really important to understand for now and for the future. And that's the task of the book, to separate period, life cycle, and cohort effects to understand what is truly generational. So period effects are where something happens and we're all affected to some degree or other, a pandemic, for example, or a financial crisis. Life cycle effects are where people change as they age and go through particular life stages. When you leave home, get a job, get married, have children, retire, all of those things change your worldviews and behaviors. And then we have cohort effects, which are the true generational effects, where a generation is different from previous generations and stays different over time. So that's what I try to do in the book, separate the myths and realities of generational change by examining those 3 different types of effects, which explain all change within societies. And I'm only going to make 4 points in the time that we have here. The first on slide 5 is that generational stereotypes are fueling fake generational battles that are distracting us from vitally important trends, would be my suggestion. And some of that can just be fun, where we stereotype people for entertainment. There's a Facebook group called A Group Where We All Pretend to Be Boomers, which was set up by 2 20-year-old Americans, where these young people pretend to be boomers and make the mistakes on social media that you associate with older people. So capitalized political rants like, my grandson forgot to call me on my birthday, thanks Obama. And then this real trend of putting inappropriate emojis, in this case a laughing emoji, over bad news. I just lost custody of my children. So these are quite light-hearted, entertaining for some people at least, types of stereotyping and just good fun. But unfortunately, there are much more serious stereotypes where we are encouraging, unthinkingly often encouraging generational conflict. So if you take climate change on slide 6, when Time magazine made Greta Thunberg their Person of the Year, they called her a standard bearer in a generational battle between old and young. And the US singer Billie Eilish was even more direct than that. She said, hopefully the adults and the old people start listening to us about climate change. Old people are going to die and don't really care if we die, but we don't want to die yet. And clearly that's an extreme example of the type of sentiment, but it does reflect a general mood and approach to divisions on between age groups on concern about climate. But when you look at slide 7, the trouble with that type of framing is there's just just about no evidence for the scale of difference that it suggests. There is no major generational break in concern about the environment. And I show that in the book through looking at generations over time on key questions. So this is the proportion of American adults that think the rise in world temperatures caused by greenhouse effect is extremely or very dangerous, split down by different generations. And you can see the youngest generations, Gen Z and millennials, are slightly more likely to think it's a extremely or very dangerous problem, but only very slightly compared to Gen X and baby boomers, for example, only a few percentage points, much less than you would expect from the rhetoric. There are larger gaps between the generations on trade-offs between climate and economic growth. Older generations less certain about that. But on the other hand, older generations are more likely to say they boycotted products or services for social purpose reasons. So it's a really mixed case. So in some ways, what we're doing with this unthinking ageism in climate campaigning is creating a generational division that is self-defeating, because we're telling older people that they don't care about climate. And we know that our understanding of the social norm for our group is very important to our own behavior. And climate is one of the issues where we need everyone to act together. So creating these divisions is really self-defeating. And the second example I wanted to touch on under this heading of generational stereotypes is around culture wars. Because from all the evidence I've looked at, culture wars are not down to a new generation of snowflakes or social justice warriors. And this is a slightly different point, because there are differences between old and young in their social and cultural attitudes. The evidence shows there are clear gaps on slide 8 between young and old on attitudes to race, immigration, gender equality and identity, sexuality, and so on. But the key point is they're not unusual gaps. There's always a gap between young and old on these types of issues. Young people are always more comfortable with social and cultural change than older groups. So that's not what's going on. Instead, I think there's two effects going on together. First of all, there's a very constant effect in history where we always think that today's young people are uniquely wrong or weird. That they're the worst generation of young people in history. And you can trace this all the way back to Socrates in 400 BC. And he had a long diatribe about how young people in his day were the worst ever, saying the children now love luxury, they have bad manners, they show disrespect for their elders, and he goes on for some time after that. But you can see it throughout ages. In 1771, a letter to the Town and Country magazine called young people of that day a race of effeminate, self-admiring, emaciated fribbles, which is more or less a definition of snowflakes just 250 years before we had that word. That's a kind of point one. Point two, though, is it does feel worse now in many ways, that we are more divided by age, but that's because that constant denigration of youth is mixed with what I'd call a period effect of fractious politics, more fractious politics, media and social media. We have an information environment now that's incentivized to amplify extreme views on either side of a debate. So we've got this sense of greater division than there actually is on these social and cultural issues. So that's point one, and it's kind of linked to point two in the sense that that type of stereotyping of exaggerating differences between generations is a particular shame, because it does distract us from really big changes in society. And one in particular is that inequality is increasingly generational and intergenerational, as we see on slide 9. And if we move to slide 10, you can see that I look at this in all sorts of ways in the book on different types of measures of income and wealth and property ownership, etc. But really, the fundamental point is there's been an extraordinary shift in wealth between generations. This is data, this chart shows data from the US, which compares the share of national wealth owned by each generation at their average cohort age, and analysis by Greg Kimbrough, a US academic. And you can just see the enormous concentration of wealth among the baby boomer generation. So when they were an average age of 45, they owned 40% of the US nation's private wealth, compared to Generation X at the same age owned 15% of the nation's private wealth, and millennials trailing way behind. So these are real effects, real big changes. And I think for me, what's important about that is we're often asked about whether generation is important or whether actually socioeconomic group is the most important thing. But I think that's a false choice of choosing either socioeconomic things as being important or generation. It's really how the two interact is increasingly important, because we've had this enormous increase in private wealth, a concentration among an older age group, but also a concentration within that baby boomer generation. Not all baby boomers made it big or rich by any means, so it's only a selection of those baby boomers that made it rich. So that means when that wealth flows down to future generations, current younger generations, we're going to have a situation where increasingly life chances are set by your family resources. And that's a real worry for inequality. One interesting point in this, a really important point, is on slide 11, is despite that huge increase in wealth among older groups compared to younger groups, there's no sign of serious intergenerational conflict. When we asked in a global study about which of the following areas do you think are most important for government to focus on to improve the life chances of young adults compared to their parents, if you look at this chart, you can see all the things at the top are things that help or benefit everyone to some degree. It's about making more jobs, more stable, supporting economic growth, increasing housing, quality of healthcare. And the red box factors, which shifting the balance of taxation from young to old or reducing benefits available to retired families, are very unpopular with people. They don't tend to get picked out. And that's for all sorts of reasons, that we love our parents and grandparents, that we feel very connected to them, that it's an indication of how we'll be treated in the future. But it points to this overall point that age is a strange characteristic to try to divide people on, because we're very connected up and down the age ranges, and you don't actually get that much sense of conflict, even with these big changes in economic circumstances. But having said that, on slide 12, there are important trends in this that point to the fact that this is not just about young versus old. In particular, we're losing faith that things will be better for our kids than us. And it has to be said on slide 13 that this is mostly about northern and western more developed countries where this is the case. This question on slide 13 is asked around over 30 countries. And it asked, to what extent, if at all, do you think today's youth will have a better or worse life than their parents, or will it be about the same? And these countries, these more developed countries, are all down the bottom. This is the bottom 9 in the list, where all these countries, the people are more likely to say it's going to be worse rather than better for young people compared to their parents, including some very depressingly low figures for countries such as France, where only 13% of people think the future is going to be better for young people than it was for their parents there. And this is a really important point. It's not just about young versus old. It's about how we all see the future because of that connection that we have up and down the generations. Our view of whether it's going to be a better or worse future for our children deeply matters to us as parents and grandparents. So sometimes this can be, when we talk about generational differences, it can feel like a competition. But in reality, it's about a vision, a more positive vision for the future. And which leads me on to my fourth and final main point for this, is that given all this, our real problem isn't conflict between age groups or generations. It's generational separation and our chronic short-termism in our policy making and decision making. And as we can see, just one example of this on slide 15, where in the US, for example, academics there talk about how we're going through a dangerous experiment in age segregation, where America used to be one of the most age integrated countries in the world and now is one of the most age segregated. Incredible changes in the mix between of young and old in local areas in the US. And we're seeing the same trend in the UK. So when you look back at 1981 to 1991, no real difference between the age profile, whether you lived in a village or in a city, just no difference in the age mix. But as you roll forward to 2011, this incredible sorting of old into smaller towns and villages, and young people moving into large towns and core cities. So cities getting younger, more rural areas getting older. And that's a huge change in a relatively short period of time. And it's not just our physical locations that are separating us. Now that our digital lives are more important to us, what we do online is more important to our lives. That's also showing deeper separations between young and old, as we see on slide 16. So this shows the proportion of French adults who say they use online social media networks every day. You can see the huge gaps between the youngest generation, Gen Z, and the oldest generation, pre-war generation, where is some of the biggest separations that I see in the whole book, across all the characteristics that I look at. Nearly 90% Gen Z online using social media every day, only 10% the pre-war generation, and 20% of the baby boomer generation. So more people, older people, are online using the internet, doing things, but we're doing different things in different places on different platforms. And this is quite generational. When I look for generational effects, what I'm looking for are flat lines in these types of charts, where a generation is different, the gaps between them are large, but they also stay different over time. It's not changing nearly as much as you might expect for a new technology. So I think those stories of separation are tied up in broader effects of both the stereotyping that we saw earlier, but also things like age becoming a new dividing line in politics in lots of countries, where which party you support is much more tied up with your age than it was in the past. And that is a new and quite dangerous development in democracies and society, because when you make age a dividing line, it does build in quite a bad dynamic to your politics, where one party thinks they've got demography on their side and they just have to wait for young people to move towards them, and the other side thinks they've got demography working against them and that their voting base is shrinking because they're dying out, so they become more extreme in emphasizing the extremeness of the other side. So this is a bad dynamic that results in that type of culture war setting, where one side is pitted against each other on the basis of age. And that's not helping our chronic short-termism, as we see on slide 17. We've just had COP26, and Professor Nicholas Stern, who wrote one of the first reports on most impactful reports on climate change, was talking at COP26 about how economists have grossly undervalued the lives of young people and future generations who are most at threat from the impacts of climate change through discount rates that economists apply to the value of investments today, because we put less value on the impact, long-term impact of those sorts of investments. So he talks about that discounting being applied in such a way that it's effectively discrimination by date of birth. So we're starting to get this thinking into policy and political discussions about how we think about the future. And the thing about humans is that we can think long-term as well as short-term. In fact, it's one of the defining characteristics of human capability is we are the ape that looked forward. We can imagine futures and work our way towards them. So it is a skill we have, but it doesn't come naturally, particularly in politics, where a week is a very long time in politics these days. So all of those kind of short-term focuses work against this longer-term intergenerational thinking. So I think we need to embed longer-term thinking into our institutions and structures. And I'll just point to actually a novel, a piece of kind of science fiction novel in the near future by Kim Stanley Robinson called The Ministry for the Future, where he imagined a world where the UN had set up an agency that was effectively about treating future generations as if they had the same rights as generations today. And it's a fascinating exercise in thinking, what would that look like? And it led to all sorts of actions that had a longer term perspective in terms of dealing with the economy, and dealing with inequality, and setting up new schemes in order to build in economic incentives for the private sector to improve the chances of avoiding catastrophic climate change. A really interesting point, but what it gets across is the importance of embedding this into institutions, because there's so much pressure going the other way to think only about the short term. So that leads me to my final slide and just conclusions. There's much, much more in the book on across lots and lots of different issues, everything from politics and trust, our health and life satisfaction and mental well-being, all the way through to sex and pornography and lots of other subjects, looking at it generationally to try to separate out what is really truly different between generations. But from the things that we've looked at today on slide 18, I think we really should be focusing on three interlinked actions for now and into the future. First of all, we need to focus on intergenerational inequality. The economic story of the last couple of decades or more has been the increase in private wealth and how that's become concentrated among certain cohorts, particularly in northern and western developed countries. But the story of the next couple of decades is going to be how that wealth transfers down to younger generations. And we need to take that really seriously if we want to avoid baking in life chances for future generations, depending on their families' resources. And then secondly, we need to rebuild and protect generational connection. We've drifted apart from each other through a lack of attention, really, to that as an issue, rather than any other kind of plan. And not only does that lead to stereotyping of generations and all those negative outcomes of a so-called generational culture war, we also miss out on the real benefits of intergenerational connection. And one of the clearest stories from the academic work on this is that there are a great deal of benefits of young and old being in contact with each other. To both sides, both young people and old people benefit from those types of interactions, and we need to build that in much more. And then finally, we need to embed longer-term intergenerational thinking into our politics and government structures. And there are some hopeful signs around that at various levels and across different countries. Wales, for example, has passed a legal act, legislation, that establishes a future generations commissioner for Wales, who is tasked with thinking about and examining the impact of today's policy decisions on future generations. There are inklings of similar sorts of moves from the European Commission in countries like Germany, already in countries like Hungary. And that type of thinking seems to be getting a bit of momentum. That would be a brilliant thing to happen for to avoid these challenges of that short-termism, but also get the benefits of a longer term perspective. So that's it from me in terms of some of the key themes from the book. I hope you found it useful. Do have a look at the book if you can. And there's also a website, generations-book.org, if you want to look at some of the data from that. Thank you.